She had been sent to catalog the dead things of Blackwood Manor, but it was the silence that felt most ancient. It was a physical weight in the air, a presence made visible by the pale shafts of winter light that lanced through the grimy conservatory glass, illuminating a slow, eternal dance of dust motes. Every footstep on the marble floor was an intrusion, every breath a sacrilege. The seal on the Fenwick family crypt was a stubborn line of mortar, hardened by centuries of damp and indifference. Rowena ran a gloved finger over the join, feeling the gritty, crumbling edge where it met the granite slab. Her work was usually with pigment and canvas, with the delicate craquelure of oil paint or the fragile temper of a fresco. But stone and silence were a language she also understood. It was the language of permanence, of things meant to be left alone. Mr. Brunt, the developer who smelled of new money and impatience, had called it a formality. Just sign off on the contents, or lack thereof, so his bulldozers could get to work. She set her lamp on a flat-topped sarcophagus nearby, its cool light pushing back the oppressive gloom. From her canvas satchel, she drew a hammer and a fine-tipped chisel. The tools felt steady in her hands, an extension of a will that found comfort in careful deconstruction. The first tap was sharp, a sound swallowed instantly by the vaulted stone ceiling. She worked with a practiced rhythm, chipping away at the seal not with force, but with precision. Each flake of mortar that fell was a syllable, a word from a long-dead mason. She listened to the whisper of the stone, her breath misting in the frigid air. The scent of the crypt wasn't of rot, but of cold earth and something else, something dry and mineral, like ozone before a storm. With a final, satisfying crack, a section of the seal gave way. A puff of air, stale and utterly still for generations, brushed against her cheek. It carried no scent she could name. It was the smell of absence. Using the edge of a pry bar, she worked it into the gap, leveraging her weight against the unyielding stone. The slab groaned, scraping against its frame with the sound of grinding teeth. Slowly, painfully, she created an opening just wide enough for her to slip through. Inside, the darkness was absolute. She retrieved her lamp, its beam cutting a trembling path through the black. The air was colder here, heavy with a pressure that seemed to press on her eardrums. This was the heart of the silence. Tombs of Fenwicks lined the walls, their names and dates worn smooth by time. She was here to document, to be the final witness. Her job was to reduce legacy to a list. One marble sarcophagus, late Gothic, moderate water damage. 3 stone ossuaries, names illegible. Her light swept across the far wall and froze. It wasn't a statue. Statues were still. This was contained, a shape huddled in the corner, folded into itself amidst a tangle of rusted iron chains and fallen masonry. The chains were anchored to the wall with a thick iron staple, the kind used to moor ships. For a moment, her cataloging mind tried to make sense of it. Vandalism? A vagrant? But the clothes were wrong, rags of what might have once been fine linen and dark wool, cut in a style centuries out of date. She took a hesitant step forward, her boots scuffing softly on the dusty floor. The shape stirred, a head lifted slowly, framed by a matted curtain of black hair. The lamp found a face. It was a sculpture of starvation, all sharp angles and hollows, the skin drawn taut over bone like vellum on a drying rack. But the eyes, they were not hollow. They burned with a faint, predatory luminescence, pupils blown wide in the sudden light. They fixed on her. A low sound rumbled from its chest, not a word but a chest-deep resonance of pure, aching need. It was the sound of an animal that had forgotten how to make any other. He moved, not with the weakness of a starving man, but with a horrifying, instantaneous speed. One moment he was huddled, the next he was airborne. A link of the ancient chain snapped with a percussive crack like a gunshot in the enclosed space. He launched himself across the crypt, a blur of rags and desperation aimed directly at her throat. Rowena didn't scream. Her breath hitched, her heart seized, but the sound died in her throat. Her life hadn't trained her for screaming. It had trained her to be still, to observe the moment of impact, to assess the damage. She saw the trajectory of his lunge, the feral snarl that pulled his lips back from pale gums, the utter, mindless hunger in his eyes. This was not a negotiation. This was an ending. He stopped. The motion was so abrupt, it seemed to violate physics. His face was inches from hers, close enough for her to feel a wave of profound cold radiating from his skin. A single drop of spittle flew from his lips and landed on her cheek, burning like ice. His breath was a foul, charnel wind, the smell of dry rot and thirst so old it had become its own element. He was trembling, a violent shudder running through his emaciated frame, his entire being locked in a war against its own primal command. Her gaze met his. She didn't see a monster. She saw a fresco shattered into 1,000 pieces, a tapestry eaten by moths, a magnificent ruin on the verge of collapsing into dust. She saw the agony of his restraint in the cords of his neck, the tremor in his clawed hands frozen in the air beside her head. He was starving, he was broken, and he had stopped. Her own fear was a distant thing, a cold knot in her stomach. Stronger, more immediate, was the instinct that drove her work, to preserve what was left, to halt the decay. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as if calming a terrified animal. She didn't back away. She reached into the satchel, still slung over her shoulder, her fingers fumbling for the small metal canteen. Her hand was shaking, but she unscrewed the cap. She held out to him, an offering, water. He stared at the canteen as if it were a holy relic, his burning eyes flicking from it to her face, a flicker of disbelief, of profound confusion, warring with the raw hunger. A choked, rasping sound escaped his throat. Bang, bang, bang. The sound from above was a physical blow, a brutal intrusion of the outside world. It vibrated through the stone floor, through the soles of her boots. Blackhead, are you down there? The lawyer's here. Says we're on the clock. Wilmot Brunt. His voice was a saw blade cutting through the fragile, impossible silence that had formed between her and the creature. The man before her recoiled at the sound, a snarl twisting his features again, the brief moment of humanity vanishing back into the feral mask. Rowena's mind raced. Brunt couldn't see this. No one could. They wouldn't see a ruin to be preserved. They'd see an animal to be put down, a problem to be erased. The bulldozers were waiting. The decision wasn't a thought. It was a current that seized her body. She acted. She grabbed the man's thin arm. His skin was shockingly cold, like marble, and shoved him back towards the dark corner. Get back, she hissed, her voice a raw whisper. Hide. He stumbled, disoriented by her touch, by the command. She didn't wait to see if he obeyed. She scrambled back through the narrow opening of the crypt, her heart hammering against her ribs. Coming, she yelled up, her voice tight and unnatural. With all her strength, she pushed the heavy granite slab back into place. It scraped and groaned, a sound of finality. Her hands found the heavy iron bolt on the exterior of the door, a mechanism she hadn't even registered on her way in. It was stiff with rust. She threw her entire weight against it. With a deafening screech of tortured metal, the bolt slid home. The tomb was sealed again. She leaned her back against the cold, unyielding stone, pressing her palms flat against it as if to hold it shut. Her breath came in ragged gasps. The adrenaline was a fire in her veins, making her tremble uncontrollably. What had she done? She had lied. She had concealed. She had locked herself on the outside of a tomb, and on the inside. A faint scraping sound echoed through the granite, muffled but unmistakable. The sound of movement from within the dark. She closed her eyes, the cold of the stone seeping into her back, a silent accomplice to the secret she now kept. The first dawn brought with it a choice made real. The light, thin and gray as watered-down milk, seeped through the grime of the library windows, finding Alaric exactly where she had left him, a sculpture of fear carved from shadow and stillness. Rowena stood in the doorway, the cold of the floorboards leaching through the wool of her socks, a small, heavy ceramic bowl in her hands. Morwenna had left it on the kitchen counter for her before retiring to her own small cottage on the grounds. No questions asked, no judgment in her gaze, just the bowl and a folded, clean linen cloth beside it. The blood was dark, nearly black and thick. Not human. The thought was a small, cold stone in Rowena's gut, a comfort she hadn't realized she desperately needed. Morwenna, in her silent, stoic way, had understood. She had provided. Rowena moved into the room, her steps measured. She was approaching a startled animal, a priceless, damaged artifact that could shatter at the wrong vibration. She set the bowl on the floor, a careful distance from his huddled form. He didn't move. His eyes, those twin pools of night, followed the motion, but his body remained locked in its rigid posture. "It's for you," she said, her voice a low murmur, the kind she used when assessing the hairline fractures in a porcelain glaze. A voice of calm, of professional distance. It was the only way she could do this. She retreated to the doorway, leaning against the frame, and waited. The silence in the room stretched, punctuated only by the groan of the old house settling around them. Minutes bled into an hour. The light strengthened, revealing the Tingjong of him more clearly. The dirt caked to his skin like a second layer of parchment, the tangled mess of his hair, the rips in the ancient fabric of his clothes. He was a ruin, and she was a restorer. This was a language she understood. Finally, a flicker of movement. A hand, skeletal and pale, trembled as it reached out, fingers uncurling. He dragged the bowl towards him with a slow, scraping sound that set her teeth on edge. He lifted it, his movements jerky, ancient, and drank. The sound was quiet, desperate. When he was done, he set the empty bowl down with a soft click and retreated back into his coil of limbs, as if the effort had cost him everything. This became their ritual. Each morning the bowl. Each day, a new task of restoration. She started with the superficial, the layers of neglect that could be gently stripped away. She brought a basin of warm water and a soft sea sponge, the kind she used for cleaning centuries of grime from marble. At first, he flinched from her touch, a low hiss vibrating in his chest. She didn't retreat. She simply held her hand still in the air near his arm, letting him feel the warmth radiating from her skin, letting him understand it was not a threat. She spoke to him as she worked, the way she sometimes spoke to her objects. "This is just water," she'd murmur, dipping the sponge. "We have to remove the surface layer of dust before we can see the true damage beneath." She cleaned his face first, wiping away the streaks of grave dirt and blood. The features that emerged were fine, aristocratic, like a Roman bust worn smooth by time and tragedy. A high brow, a straight nose, a jawline that could have been cut from granite. His skin was cold, not like ice, but like stone on a winter's morning. Beneath the filth, it was unervingly perfect, without pore or flaw, only the faintest blue tracery of veins at his temples. He closed his eyes under administration, his breathing evening out. He was still a trapped thing, but he was letting her tend to the cage. The days melted into a week then, too. The world outside the high stone walls of Blackwood Manor ceased to exist. Wilmot Brunt's letters went unanswered. Borden Slate's calls went to a disconnected phone. Her world had shrunk to the dimensions of this library, to the scent of dust and old paper and the strange, cold, loamy smell of Alaric himself. Morwenna was her only link to the outside, a silent co-conspirator. She would leave food for Rowena and the bowl of blood for Alaric on a tray outside the library door, knocking once before her footsteps retreated down the hall. They never spoke of him. The unspoken agreement hung between them, as solid and binding as a legal contract. We protect this house. We protect what is inside it. Rowena grew to know the topography of him, the scar that curled like a white worm above his left eyebrow, the unnatural stillness of his chest, the absence of a heartbeat, a constant, terrifying reminder of what he was. She grew accustomed to the way his eyes tracked her every move, not with predatory hunger, but with a watchful, unnerving intelligence. He was learning her just as she was learning him, a silent, mutual assessment. His hair was the last great challenge. It was a long, tangled mat, thick with dirt and dried leaves and things she didn't want to identify. It was a shroud of his long neglect. She found an old silverback comb in one of her mother's dressers, its teeth wide and strong. One afternoon, when the sun slanted through the window in a rare golden bar, she sat on the floor a few feet from him, holding it up. "This will probably hurt," she said softly, "but it needs to be done." He watched her, his head tilted. He offered no resistance when she moved closer, sinking to her knees behind him. Her own heart hammered against her ribs. This was a different kind of intimacy. The cleaning had been clinical, detached. This was personal. She touched his hair, her fingers sinking into the coarse, thick mass. It felt more like animal pelt than human hair. She started at the very ends, working with painstaking patience, teasing out one small knot at a time. The comb snagged. He tensed, a low growl rumbling in his throat. "Shoo," she whispered, her voice close to his ear. "Easy. I'll be gentle." She held the lock of hair at the root to keep from pulling on his scalp, a trick her own mother had used on her when she was a child. The memory surfaced, sharp and clear. The scent of her mother's lavender soap, the gentle, rhythmic tug of the brush, the feeling of safety, of being cared for. Rowena's hand slowed, the motion becoming more rhythmic, more soothing. She worked for over an hour, the pile of shed hair and debris growing beside her. The scent of him, the earthy, ancient smell, filled her senses. Slowly, painstakingly, a curtain of dark, straight hair began to emerge, the color of jet, unstained by gray. It fell past his shoulders, heavy and clean. She was nearing the scalp now, her fingers brushing against the cold skin of his neck. He was utterly still, his tension having bled away into a profound quiet. As she drew the comb through the last of the tangles, a sound started, low and deep in his chest. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a word. It was a vibration, a resonant hum that traveled from his body into the floorboards beneath her knees, up through her own bones. It was a sound like a cello string being bowed in a vast, empty cathedral, a thrumming purr of deep animal contentment, of safety. He leaned his head back slightly, silent invitation, and the sound grew stronger. Rowena's hand stilled, the comb hovering in midair. The sound wrapped around her, a physical presence in the silent room. It was the most profound expression of trust she had ever been given. In that moment, he was not a monster, not a relic, not a project. He was just Alaric, and she was the one who had made him feel safe enough to make that sound. A strange, fierce possessiveness bloomed in her chest. He was hers to protect. The low, distant rumble started a few days later. At first, Rowena dismissed it as thunder, a storm rolling in from the coast. But the sky remained a flat, featureless gray. The sound persisted, a deep, grinding tremor that seemed to come from the earth itself. Wilmot Brunt. The preparatory work for the demolition. The sound was the growl of an excavator, the roar of a diesel engine. It was the sound of her world being threatened. Alaric felt it too. The purr had ceased. He was on edge, his stillness no longer calm but coiled like a spring wound too tight. He spent the days in the darkest corner of the library, away from the windows, his head in his hands, as if trying to block out the insistent, grinding noise. Rowena found her own anxiety mirroring his. She paced the length of the library, the sound of physical irritant, a drill bit boring into her skull. Every metallic clang, every roar of the engine, was a countdown to the end of this strange sanctuary she had built. She felt Brunt's presence like a stain spreading across the landscape, a vulgar intrusion into the sacred quiet of the estate. The midpoint came without warning. It was a Tuesday morning. The noise outside was louder than ever before, accompanied by a new sensation, a tremor that ran through the very foundations of the house. A deep, rhythmic thump, 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 like a giant metallic heartbeat. They were using a pile driver or a breaker, something heavy, something designed to shatter stone. The first impact shook the books on their shelves. A cloud of dust puffed from the ceiling plaster. Alaric screamed. It was not a human sound. It was a shriek of pure, primal terror, ripped from a place beyond language. He scrambled backward, his body contorting, trying to press himself into the very stone of the fireplace. His eyes were wide, the pupils blown so large they swallowed the iris entirely. They were pits of pure black panic. Thump! Another tremor. A glass paperweight on the desk rattled and fell, shattering on the floorboards. Alaric clawed at the stone, his nails making a horrifying scraping sound. He was trying to dig his way out, to escape the shaking, collapsing world. He was reliving something. This wasn't just fear of a loud noise. This was the echoing terror of an old trauma. The tomb, the darkness, the feeling of being buried alive. Rowena moved without thinking. All her detached, professional calm evaporated, replaced by a fierce, instinctual need to stop his suffering. She crossed the room in 3 strides and threw herself around him, pressing her body against his back, wrapping her arms around his chest. He thrashed against her a wild, panicked strength she was no match for. His elbow caught her jaw, sending a starburst of pain through her head. She grunted, tightening her grip, burying her face against his back. The cold of his body was absolute now, a deep, cellular chill. "It's all right," she gasped, her voice strained, shouting to be heard over the pounding outside and the frantic hammering of her own heart. "I'm here. It's just a sound. It can't hurt you. I have you." Thump! The entire room seemed to jump. Alaric let out another strangled cry, a sound of agony. He was shaking uncontrollably, his muscles locked and rigid. She held on, making her body an anchor, a shield. She tried to absorb the vibrations for him, to impose her own living warmth, her own steady reality, onto his terror. "Listen to me," she commanded, her lips pressed close to his ear, the ancient fabric of his shirt rough against her cheek. "Listen to my voice, not the noise outside, just me." She started talking, saying anything that came into her head. She described the process of mixing gesso, of grinding pigments. She talked about the way gold leaf had to be applied with a whisper of breath. Mundane details, the litany of her craft. Her voice was shaking but steady, a constant presence against the violent, percussive rhythm from outside. Slowly, miraculously, the thrashing began to subside. The violent shudders softened into tremors. He was still rigid with fear, but he was no longer fighting her. He sagged back against her, his weight suddenly immense, and the only thing holding him up was her. She could feel the frantic, silent scream still trapped in his body. The pounding outside stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by the echo of the machinery and their ragged breathing. Dust motes danced in the air. Rowena remained where she was, holding him, her muscles aching from the strain. She felt a tremor run through him, a different kind this time, a shudder of release. His head lolled back, resting on her shoulder. His eyes were closed. For a moment, she feared the shock had destroyed him, sent him back into that catatonic state. Then, a voice, rough as stones grinding together, a sound that hadn't been used for an eternity. It rasped against the silence. "They did this before." Rowena froze. The words were English, but stretched on a rack of time. The vowels long and the consonants sharp and strange. "Archaic." "What?" she whispered. "Alaric." He turned his head slightly, his cold cheek brushing against hers. His eyes open, no longer black with panic, but focused on some distant point in his memory. "The storm," he breathed, the words forming with visible effort. "The other houses fell. They put me into stone to keep me safe." The world tilted on its axis. Rowena's understanding of everything shattered and reassembled itself into a new, terrifying, brilliant shape. He hadn't been imprisoned as a monster. He had been hidden, a treasure locked in a vault to protect it from the ravages of a war, a plague, a siege, a storm that had brought down the other houses of his time. The Fenwicks hadn't been his jailers. They had been his guardians, and she was the last of them. This changed everything. This wasn't an act of charity or morbid curiosity anymore. It was a duty, a sacred inheritance. The man she held in her arms was not a beast to be tamed, but a legacy to be protected. The house was not his prison. It was his last remaining shield. and Wilmot Brunt was outside, trying to tear it down. A new kind of anger, cold and hard as diamond, formed in her heart. It was the protective fury of a curator whose collection was threatened by a barbarian. In the days that followed, the bond between them solidified into something unbreakable. He was still largely silent, but his eyes followed her with a new expression, not just watchfulness, but a kind of questioning reliance. He had trusted her with his story, the core of his trauma, and she had not run. She had held him through it. The noises from outside became a constant, grating backdrop to their lives. Rowena found herself listening intently, trying to decipher the sounds, to gauge how much time they had. She felt like a soldier in a besieged castle, counting the blows of the battering ram against the gate. She and Alaric were inhabitants of a forgotten island, and the tide was rising, threatening to swallow them whole. One evening, Morwenna did not leave the tray and retreat. She stood in the doorway, her face grim, her hands clasped in front of her. "Mr. Brunt is getting impatient," she said, her voice low. "He brought his lawyer, Slate, to the grounds today. They were walking the perimeter." Rowena's blood went cold. "Did they try to come in?" "Not yet. But the look on that man's face, he sees this place as a pile of rock and timber blocking his view. Nothing more." Morwenna's gaze flickered to the shadows where Alaric sat, a silent acknowledgement passing between the two women. "He will not stop." "Neither will I," Rowena said, the words tasting like iron. She spent the next day combing through the house records again, the dusty ledgers and deeds in her great-grandfather's study. But this time, she wasn't looking for a loophole to save the house. She was looking for a weapon, some forgotten covenant, some ancient right-of-way, anything that would give her legal ground to stand on, anything to stop the machines. She worked late into the night, the only light from a small desk lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls. Alaric sat in the corner of the study, a silent sentinel. His presence was a comfort, a quiet weight that kept the rising panic at bay. It was close to midnight when the sound came, not the distant rumble of machinery, but something closer, sharper, a car door slamming, right at the front of the house. Rowena froze, a dusty legal deed clutched in her hand. Alaric went utterly still, his head lifting, his focus aimed at the door. They listened, a pair of startled deer scenting a wolf on the wind. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel drive. Then the unmistakable, jarring sound of a key scraping in the front door lock. A key she hadn't given anyone. The lock tumbled. The heavy oak door groaned open, and a voice, loud, abrasive, and utterly profane in the sacred silence of the house, echoed up from the main hall. "See? Told you the old key would still work. Gloomy, bloody mausoleum, isn't it? Right, let's find the squatter and have this done with." It was the voice of Wilmot Brunt. He was inside. The sanctuary had been breached. The shatter of glass was not a sound of the old house. It was a violation, a sharp, modern violence that ripped through the centuries of quiet groans and settled dust. Rowena's heart slammed against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage of bone. Her breath caught, a knot of ice in her throat. The sound came from downstairs, the great hall. She was out of bed before the last shard had finished skittering across the flagstones, her bare feet silent on the cold wood of the corridor. Her mind, a catalog of vulnerabilities, raced through the manor's layout, the window beside the main hearth, its leaded panes already fragile. A perfect point of entry, a flaw she had noted but had not yet had the chance to mend. Another sound, a man's cough, thick and arrogant. Then a voice, amplified by the hall's vaulted ceiling, a bullhorn in a cathedral. "Fenwick, we know you're in here. You bloody squatter. This is a formal notice of eviction, served in person. Wilmot Brunt." The voice was as crass and overbearing as the man himself. Rowena flattened herself against the wall of the upper gallery, peering through the carved balustrade. Below, two figures stood silhouetted against the shattered window, moonlight glinting on the glass at their feet. Brunt, a heavy-set shadow, and beside him a leaner, sharper form she recognized as his lawyer, Borden Slate. Slate held a high-powered torch, its beam cutting a surgical swathe through the darkness, dancing over the tapestries and stone. "This is breaking and entering, Wilmot." Slate's voice was a low, clipped murmur, a razor's edge of unease. "This could compromise the case." "It is the case," Brunt boomed, his voice echoing with a proprietary fury. "This filth has been living in my property, rent-free. I'm documenting his illegal occupation. Get your phone out." Pictures. Rowena's blood ran cold. This wasn't about the law. This was about humiliation, about power. They were provoking a confrontation, hoping for a reaction they could use. Her gaze darted to the deep shadows near the hearth, the alcove where Alaric often sat, hidden from the world. "Please, Alaric, stay hidden, stay calm." The beast that slumbered within him was a fragile thing, easily woken by rage and fear. Her fear, his rage. The torch beam swept across the room, methodical and cold. It landed on the worn velvet of the wingback chair by the hearth. The chair was empty. A small, tight knot of relief loosened in Rowena's chest. "See? Nothing," Slate said. "Let's go. We'll file the motion in the morning." "No." Brunt took a step forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the glass. The sound was an agony to Rowena's ears, a desecration. "He's here. I can smell the rot." He took a deep, theatrical breath. "Come out, Fenwick. Face me like a man." And then he was there. Alaric did not step from the shadows. He simply resolved. One moment, there was an empty space near the grand staircase. The next, he occupied it. He stood not with the posture of a cornered animal, but with the stillness of a statue carved from night and marble. He wore the simple dark trousers and linen shirt she had laid out for him, but they seemed transformed, ancient vestments on a forgotten king. The torch beam swung wildly and found him. It bleached the color from his face, leaving only stark plains and the abyssal darkness of his eyes. Brunt started, a strangled gasp escaping his lips. "There you are. Took you long enough." His bravado was a thin, cracking veneer over a sudden spike of fear. Rowena's knuckles were white where she gripped the balustrade. She could feel it coming, the shift she had seen once before. The subtle tension in his shoulders, the predatory focus in his gaze. She saw the beast uncoiling, and her mind screamed for him to stop, to hold on to the man she had so painstakingly helped piece back together. "This is private property," Slate said, his voice regaining a measure of professional steel, though his torch hand trembled slightly. "You are trespassing. We are giving you 10 minutes to vacate the premises before we call the authorities." Alaric said nothing. He just watched them, and in that silence, the entire manor seemed to hold its breath. The air grew heavy, thick with the scent of ozone and dust, the smell of a coming storm. Rowena, the restorer, saw the change not as a physical transformation, but as a shift in texture and light. The moonlight seemed to bend around him, his shadow deepening until it was a pool of absolute black that the torch could not penetrate. "Did you hear him?" Brunt took another aggressive step. "Get out!" Rowena saw Alaric's hand clench at his side. She saw the muscles in his jaw bunch. This was it, the breaking point. He would lunge, and the world would end in a spray of red on ancient stone. She opened her mouth to scream his name, to pull him back from the precipice. But the sound that came was not hers. It was Alaric's. It was not a word. It was a note, a low, resonant hum that started in his chest and expanded outwards, not as sound, but as pressure. Rowena felt it in her teeth, in the bones of her skull. The tapestries on the wall vibrated. Dust motes, suspended for a century, danced in the torchlight. Then came the word. Crumble. The voice was not Alaric's. It was deeper, older, layered with 1,000 echoes of command. It was the voice of the house itself, of the Fenwick bloodline, of the very stone beneath their feet. It was a physical force, a wave of absolute authority that slammed into the two men. Borden Slate, the cold, rational lawyer, dropped as if his spine had been severed. His knees hit the flagstones with a wet, cracking sound. The torch fell from his grasp, rolling away to cast wild, dancing shadows up the walls. His face was a mask of pure, uncomprehending terror, his mind shattered by an order it was physiologically impossible to disobey. Wilmot Brunt fought it. His body shuddered, his face contorting in a rictus of effort and disbelief. A low, strangled moan escaped his lips. His legs trembled violently, sweat beading on his forehead. He was a man of immense ego, a wolf forged in boardrooms and hostile takeovers, and that was now breaking against something ancient and absolute. Alaric took a single, silent step forward. The shadows clung to him, flowing from him like a cloak. "You are nothing." The second command was not loud. It was a whisper that filled the entire hall, a pronouncement of fact. It stripped away Brunt's wealth, his power, his identity. It showed him his own insignificance in the face of true, timeless authority. Brunt broke. A raw, animal cry of pure terror tore from his throat. His legs gave out completely, and he felt his knees, his hands scrabbling at the stone floor. He collapsed onto the flagstones, his expensive suit offering no protection against the terror freezing his very marrow. He was weeping, fat, gasping sobs of a man whose universe had just been ripped apart. Alaric stood over them, a figure of terrible majesty. He was not a beast. He was a judge, the lord of the manor, in a way Brunt could never comprehend. "Leave, and forget you were ever welcome in this place. Your claim is dust." The final command was a release. The pressure in the room vanished. Brunt scrambled backwards, crab-walking over the broken glass, his hands bleeding. He didn't care. He pushed himself to his feet and ran, stumbling, crashing through the broken window frame and out into the night, his panicked screams fading into the darkness. Borden Slate remained on his knees for a moment longer, shaking uncontrollably. Then, with a robotic, jerky motion, he rose. He didn't look at Alaric. He couldn't. He walked stiffly, like a man in a trance, back towards the window, stepping over his fallen torch, and disappeared after his client. Silence descended. A profound, deafening silence, broken only by the whisper of the night, whined through the shattered window. The violence was over, not with a bang, but with the utter annihilation of will. Rowena's breath came out in a long, shuddering sigh. She lowered herself to the floor, her own legs too weak to hold her. Her heart still hammered against her ribs, but it was the frantic beat of awe, not fear. He hadn't become the beast. He had become something far, far more powerful. Below, Alaric stood perfectly still in the center of the hall. The terrible power receded from him, like a tide pulling away from the shore, leaving him looking smaller, older. He slowly turned his head and looked up, his gaze finding hers in the darkness of the gallery. His eyes were not the eyes of a predator, but of an incredibly weary man who had just carried an impossible weight. The storm had passed, leaving behind a quiet devastation and a changed landscape. The air in the library smelled of beeswax, old paper, and the faint, clean scent of turpentine from a restoration kit. Hours had passed. The moon had tracked across the sky, its silver light now falling through the tall arched windows, illuminating the spines of books that had not seen the light of day in 100 years. The only sound was the soft crackle of a newly laid fire in the hearth, a small pocket of warmth against the lingering chill of the night's violation. Rowena sat in one of the deep leather armchairs, a heavy blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She had cleaned the glass from the great hall, her hands moving with the methodical calm that always centered her. The act of mending, of putting things back in order, was her anchor, but her mind was still adrift in the memory of that voice. That power. Alaric sat in the chair opposite, staring into the flames. He hadn't spoken since he'd come to find her in the hall, his face pale and drawn. The terrifying majesty was gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of his bones. For the first time, she could see the full weight of his 840 years, not as a curse or a sickness, but as an accumulated burden. He looked less like a monster and more like a mountain, eroded by time, but fundamentally immovable. "What was that?" she finally asked, her voice barely a whisper, afraid to break the fragile peace. "That voice." He didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the fire. "It is the will of the house," he said, his own voice quiet, rough with disuse. The voice of the bloodline, a compulsion woven into the foundation of this place. Every Fenwick who has been lord of this manor possessed it. It is a tool of command, of protection, of order. You ordered them, she breathed, understanding dawning. You didn't just scare them, you commanded them. I commanded their fear. I commanded their submission. He clarified. It requires focus, a stillness. For centuries, the hunger made that impossible. The rage was too loud. It drowned everything else out. He finally turned his head, and his eyes met hers. They were clear, lucid, and filled with a sorrow, so deep it felt like a physical space. You quieted the rage, Rowena. You gave me back the silence. The implication hung between them, heavy and beautiful. Her work, her patient mending of art and soul, had not just healed the man. It had restored the guardian. She hadn't just saved him from the beast. She had given him the means to control it, to channel his ancient nature into something else entirely. Not a predator, but a protector. She looked around the library. Her brushes and solvents were neatly arranged on a side table. The half-restored portrait of his ancestor, a man with the same piercing eyes, hung above the mantelpiece. This was her sanctuary, the place she had rebuilt. And he was its heart. You didn't hurt them, she said, the realization settling deep inside her. You could have torn them to pieces. But you chose not to. To kill them would have been the beast's way, he said softly. Simple. Final. But to break their will, to make them flee in terror of their own insignificance, that is the Lord's way. It ensures they will never return. It protects the boundary. He paused, the firelight catching the tired lines around his eyes. It protects you. The last two words were the foundation of everything. The legal threat was gone. Wilmot Brunt would dissolve into his own greed. Haunted by a memory his rational mind would forever try to deny. The manor was safe. She was safe. But the victory felt less like a triumph and more like a profound settling, a final piece of a complex restoration locking into place. The cost had been the revelation of what he truly was and the acceptance of it. She stood and walked him, kneeling on the thick rug beside his chair. The firelight warmed her face. He didn't move, but his gaze followed her, watchful, patient. She reached out, her restorer's hand, so accustomed to the delicate surfaces of canvas and wood, and gently touched the back of his. His skin was cool, smooth like polished marble. There was no tremor in it, none of the feral energy that had once thrummed just beneath the surface. There was only a great, ancient stillness. He turned his hand over, his long, pale fingers lacing with hers. His touch wasn't the grasp of a lover or the hold of a desperate man. It was a silent, permanent anchor, a union of the mender and the mended, the restorer and the restored. In a warm, quiet library, surrounded by history and reborn beauty, they were no longer two broken souls hiding from the world. They were the sanctuary itself, complete and unbreakable. The battle for a home is rarely fought with fists, but with the will to endure. This story explores how true strength isn't found in unleashing the beast within, but in mastering it, and how the quiet, patient act of restoration can build a fortress more powerful than any wall. If you were moved by Rowena and Alaric's fight for their sanctuary, please subscribe to the channel for more tales of darkness, light, and the quiet courage that lives in between. Like this video, and share in the comments what the word sanctuary means to you.